Ms. Wiley, I found some of the opening statements quite interesting that we heard from our witnesses here today. Plenty of claims being thrown out there. One I thought that was particularly interesting was the idea that a company, a large company, perhaps a company like Disney or any other employer, aspiring to maybe have about 30% of new hires and having a goal of 30% of new hires being from diverse backgrounds or people of color. And the assertion that that kind of goal was anti-white discrimination.
It's shockingly common, as we've seen from this testimony, that for huge corporations to implement programs that amount to the kind of blatant racial quota setting that would make even Harvard University blush. Executives in banking, technology, and consulting came forward in 2020 to promise to hire a concrete quota of 100,000 Black, Latino, and Asian workers in the next decade. There can be no doubt then that the discrimination pendulum in America's biggest companies has swung past equality and meritocracy towards discriminating against employees who are white, male, or lack other favored characteristics.
I wanted to break things down in terms of the numbers a little bit. About what percentage of Americans are white, non-Hispanic white? I think we're hearing from the census, is it like 59, 60%, is that right?
That is about right, yes.
Okay, so about 59% of every American, of all Americans, are white. That would mean about 40% of people are people of color of the US population. And it seems to be that the argument is that seeking to have 30% of your hires be people of color is anti-white discrimination. Can you shed some light on the logic of that for me, please?
No, because that's not logical.
With all of this discussion around how diversity, equity, and inclusion policies are discriminatory in the long history of anti-integration in this country and reaction and opposition to the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and more, I think one of the things that we need to take a look at is the world that they're fighting for, a world without diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, which is to say the default, which is to say workplaces that are honestly kind of like Congress, because the population of the United States, as we mentioned, is about 59% white. Do you know what percentage of Congress is white?
I don't, but I know that we finally have 60 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is progress.
But even then, 75%. White Americans make up 60%, 59% of the US population, 75% of Congress. Men are 50% of the population and make about 70% of Congress. When we see institutions of power, when we see, and that is reflected in almost any institutional organization of power, and when we even just try to have the basic acknowledgement that it would be good to encourage not an unreflective body, not unreflective workforce, but a workforce that barely even reaches the proportion of representation of what everyday Americans look like. That's somehow anti-white discrimination, anti-male discrimination, anti-straight discrimination, anti-cisgender discrimination. I mean, come on, folks. What are we doing here? What are we doing here? And lastly, Ms. Wiley, I was wondering if you could also just shed some light on the economic impact of civil rights legislation, and if you could draw that link between civil rights protections and policies and outcomes that help the working class.
Yeah, one of the critical things we have seen as a result of having civil rights protections and having them enforced is we have seen an increase in participation and people getting to the middle class of the American country, particularly people of color, long denied fair and equal opportunities. And I think it's really important to understand that that has had widespread societal benefits. For example, thanks to civil rights laws, we have seen an increase in the life expectancy of people who are black, and not only black, other people of color, and that's something we all want. One of the things that's so important to understand about the Sheets case, because we keep hearing about this, and it is being misrepresented. What the Sheets case says isn't you have to hire any old body who's a person of color, no matter their criminal background. It's saying you can't use what is colorblind on its face, but has the practical effect of denying employment if it does not bear a relationship to the job that is going to be done. You can absolutely say an accountant who has been convicted of absconding with money, you don't have to hire that person. The reason that the Sheets case is a lawsuit is because they didn't have evidence that they needed to do that, and it was discriminating against qualified black applicants.